So what I would ask you to do is get comfy. You're already automatically trying to get comfortable. And the idea of getting comfy is to be in a position where you will stay awake, but be comfy, right? So you'll feel relaxed, but you won't fall asleep. So whatever position works, great. If you want to get on the floor, you can. That's great. Howdy, welcome. Hey, good to see you. Yeah, all right, great. Good to see you. So a little bit of sensory deprivation is a helpful thing, I think, in mindfulness practice. So you can close your eyes and get relaxed. And this practice is about observing, okay? Watching our thoughts and our feelings and our urges and our sensations. And whatever comes to the forefront of our attention, we focus on that, pay attention to it, with loving, caring attention. If you feel a judgment about the experience that you're having at the time, then just observe the judgment. Observe the fact that you have an opinion about this experience that you're having, or an attitude toward it. Observe the attitude that you have toward this experience. And this experience can be anything. It can be all the noise we hear outside. It can be the rumbling in your stomach. It can be that itch you have in your arm. It can be thoughts about an encounter you had yesterday that you wished you'd handled differently. It can be anything. All of it is gristful milk. So in silence, we observe these things as they arise. We let them pass when something else takes over our attention. And we observe the flow of these experiences without judgment. If we have a judgment, we observe that and we let it pass. And we let the flow of experience move through us. And we accept it as it is. We don't try to change the experience. We don't try to fix the problems that we're observing. If we try to fix them, we observe that we're trying to fix them, so we reflect on that. And really what we're doing in this practice is being friends to ourselves, being a loving presence, like we would to someone that we love, that's dear to us, that we want to be present for, without judgment, without opinions, without trying to fix. Just being a loving, attending presence. So let's keep silence for a few minutes. Do this practice. Just watch, lovingly and attentively. Then, slowly we open our eyes again. See what kind of echoes of that experience continue as we carry on together. What was that like? Any experiences that you had in a very short time? What's it like to do that? Yes?
I was struck by the contrast between the knowledge out there and the silence in here.
Yeah.
And I stopped at the rally for a few minutes.
Yeah.
Energy to make myself right and make others wrong, and the contrast between here and observing things. So,
you're observing the contrast.
Yeah.
Good. Others, any experiences, things that you noticed as you did this?
I watched myself and I saw someone who was faking it to make it. I thought that is some judgment by itself, and then reminded myself it's not about making it in the first place.
Yeah. Just letting it be whatever you're experiencing and not trying to do it a certain way or reach a certain result. Yeah. Good. Anybody else? It's very short. That's a taste of mindfulness practice. And I've been doing this practice myself for about 35 years. And what I learned in the course of doing this practice early on is I began to ask a question after a while, because in meditation, in mindfulness practice, I got to a point where I began to identify myself more with the observer part of myself than with the observed. Okay? You get to a point where the me, the real me, is the one who is watching with loving, open attention what's happening inside and around me. So it's almost like there's two me's, right? The me that's observing and the me that is observed. The self that watches and the self that is being watched. So who are you? Who are you? Who are you? The observer or the observed? Or both? It's a question that comes up as a consequence of this practice. Meister Eckhart was a 14th century mystic priest, Catholic priest in Germany. He once said in one of his sermons, he said, "The eye with which I see God is the eye with which God sees me." Mindful Christianity is mysticism. It's this experience that Meister Eckhart talks about. It's the experience of spiritual union with the divine. The capital S self that observes the small s self. The divine self that watches the personality, the ego that we associate with ourselves so much of the time. The observer side of this equation and mindfulness practice is God. And God is lovingly attentive toward our experience, lovingly attentive toward every feeling, every urge, every sensation, every thought. In mindfulness practice, God is noticing all that is going on inside of you with deep compassion without judgment. So who are you? Who am I? I am God experiencing Jim Burklo's particular unique life on a particular planet at a particular time, and you are God experiencing you in a particular place, at a particular time and space. God is more than you and I are, of course, but through this practice of mindfulness, through this practice of mystical spirituality in Christianity, we can come to know God personally. The definition that we use in the mindful.usc.edu initiative on campus is pretty simple and straightforward, and it talks about a very specific state of mind. And the definition we're using is this: 3 parts: awake, open, and kind. Awake, knowing what is happening right now, in the present moment, in the changing flow of experience. So it's paying attention to what we're experiencing, but also paying attention to the flow of that experience, how it changes, because we keep focusing on different things as we keep the silence and maintain this practice. So you start noticing there's a flow to it, a movement. Open, that means allowing what is happening right now just to be. So it's letting go of trying to change that. It's just allowing what is to be what is. Not trying to fix it, not trying to change it or alter it. And then kind, to respond to whatever arises with self-compassion. So mindfulness practice is a discipline of kindness. Come on, it's safe. Hi there, welcome. So it cultivates kindness for ourselves, and then a benefit of that self-kindness is the cultivation of kindness toward other people. You don't have to be a Christian. You don't have to be a person who's affiliated in any way with any faith at all to have this experience and to practice mindfulness. Again, it's a very specific state, a very specific kind of experience. It can be maintained by secular practices and religious practices alike. But I would say that Christianity is a very special container for this experience. It offers enrichment and enhancement for the state of mind that we are looking for in mindfulness practice. Context in a wider, deeper spiritual tradition. At its best, I think Christian spirituality as a whole might be thought of as mindfulness plus. So tonight we're going to explore the ways that the state of mindfulness has been reached through spiritual disciplines of Christianity from the time of Jesus until now. Now, in the mind of the public, mostly I think people think of mindfulness as associated with Buddhism or Eastern religion, which certainly makes sense because it's there. And it's interesting to ponder why it is that we associate it with Eastern religion when it's very much part of Christian tradition from the beginning. Why do we not associate it with Christianity as well? I guess the simple answer I would offer, and it'd be fun to discuss this, argue about it, but basically the Eastern religions, when they came to the United States, which happened before Asian people moved here, mostly, there was a wave of interest in the Western world and in America in Buddhism and Hinduism and other Asian religious traditions. But the parts of Asian religion that came here were more or less devoid of elaborate theology and cultural overlay. So what we wound up with were kind of the refined spiritual disciplines, the refined essence of Eastern religions, without the cultural accretions, without the folk beliefs, without the superstitions, without the rituals that are commonly seen in Asia. So if you meet a Buddhist in America who is a white person, very often that person's version of Buddhism that they practice is confined to some meditation discipline, as opposed to, again, to the folk and other theological traditions of the religion. You might say that Americans just generally don't know about the bathwater that the baby Buddha sits in Asia. Okay? But in America, we have, in Christianity, we have the baby Jesus in lots of bathwater of dogma, doctrine, etc., which very often obscures people's access to the spiritual tradition of the religion. So we associate Christianity with dogma, doctrine, interpretations of Scripture, very scripturally oriented, and much less so with the very long and very deep spiritual practices of the faith, which, when we explore them, look awfully familiar in many ways to what we find in the Asian traditions. So this has made it a little harder for Americans to, Western people in general, to access this part of our tradition because we just have not been in the habit of associating it with meditation disciplines. Now, I don't mean to disparage all the elaborate, complex theologies and practices of all the world's religions at all. They're very valuable and beautiful and important, but they sometimes do get in the way of appreciating the mystical heart, the mystical experience at the center of these faiths. Some years ago, I got to know a really interesting man by the name of Thomas Hand. He was a Jesuit priest. Did you know him? Wonderful.
I know of him.
Oh, excellent. Okay, Father Hand. What a marvelous person. Father Hand was a Jesuit priest, and he worked as a missionary in Japan for many, many years. Like 29 years, I believe. And the whole time, he became a practitioner of Zen Buddhism and became effectively a Zen master. Then he came back to the United States and became the confessor, the priest in residence at a monastery of nuns in Burlingame, California, just south of San Francisco. And there, that was a pretty progressive bunch of nuns. Anyway, they allowed him to create a zendo in their monastery, where he held forth and taught Zen Buddhism to people who came. So here's Father Hand. He becomes a Zen master. He was known as Hando in Japan. So Hando was the guy you went to learn Zen in the Mid-Peninsula area south of San Francisco. Well, I had him speak at Stanford when I worked there. One time he came to speak, and he gave a very profound lecture in which he said, we Catholics have had it backwards for years. In catechism, etc., we teach doctrine, we teach dogma, we teach all the facts, if you will, of the Catholic Church and its beliefs. And then maybe if you're lucky, way down the line, you might get introduced to Catholic spirituality. You might get introduced to the experience of God. So you'll hear all the facts about God, and then maybe, if you're lucky, if you take a special class much later on, you could learn about actually meeting God, or experiencing God. So he said, we've got it backwards, we have to turn this around, we have to teach people how to experience God, and then that experience will make sense or nonsense of Catholic doctrine and dogma. And wise words, I thought. For him, Zen Buddhism was completely compatible with Catholicism. He believed that it helped you become a better Christian and a better Catholic. Again, he was looking at what you might call the refined essence of the Buddhist tradition, and also the refined essence of Christianity. His experience, his analysis made sense to me personally, resonated with my own experience. I grew up a mainline Protestant Christian person, Presbyterian congregational churches, and it was the same. We learned the details, we learned the history, we learned the catechism, we learned, studied the Bible, etc. Nothing about how to experience God directly, nothing about spiritual practice. For that, I had to go outside of the church to learn. I knew very little of contemplative prayer practice until I got to Presbyterian seminary. And there, it was kind of fun because I think the seminary understood that I was a slightly offbeat character, so they gave me a very offbeat roommate who had spent 2 years in a year and a half, I think, in a Tibetan Buddhist monastery. And he had no hair, buzz-cut hair. He was a monk, basically. And he had tried to sign up to be a Buddhist there, and his Lama said, no, you have freckles, go home. And study the religion of your culture, and be the best meditator, and be the most mindful, awake, spiritually awake Christian you can be. Now, I think it'd be great if Christians would say the same thing to Buddhists who come to America. It's a whole other story. Anyway, so that's what he did. And he came to seminary. Yes, sir. Came to the seminary. So when I met him, I go, okay, teach me everything. So every morning we would get up at 6 in the morning and go do mindfulness meditation in the Presbyterian chapel. And that's how I started to have the experience of a discipline of encountering and experiencing God, which then led me into Christian spirituality, becoming more aware of it. There's a history here of this experience of mindfulness and the direct mystical experience of God in Christianity, and of course it starts before Jesus, really, but it certainly starts with Jesus. Jesus practiced mindfulness. He started his career as an itinerant rabbi after having a 40-day retreat in the desert. Yes, that wonderful story. The Gospels describe this as a temptation by Satan. I think it helps to understand who Satan was in first century Christianity. Yes, the character that we have that we consider Satan today is a very different character than the one that we find in the New Testament, or certainly very different than, and the one in the New Testament is different than the Satan character in the Hebrew Scriptures. There are a couple different versions of the Satan character in the Hebrew Scriptures also. You might think of Satan more as the Attorney General, right? You know, we talk about the devil's advocate. Well, the devil was the devil's advocate, okay? The devil was the advocate for checking out whether people were really as good as they pretended to be. Yes? So you see that in the story of Job and the Hebrew Scriptures, etc. So in this case, the same thing applies. You know, Satan is the personification of a practice of mindfulness, right? Satan is asking the questions. Who are you, Jesus? Who are you really? And then you see the story in the New Testament of Jesus being asked, like, okay, so Satan says, you know, worship me and all the kingdoms of the world will bow down to you. And Jesus says, no, that's not who I am. I'm not that person. I'm not a temporal king in that way. And he says, you know, turn this bread into stone. You know, you're a Superman.
Other way.
I mean, thank you very much. That helps a lot.
I'm sorry, we have to.
That really is important. Yes. Turn this stone into bread. You know, in other words, be Superman. And Jesus says, no, I'm not Superman. In effect, so Satan is testing him. It's the temptation. Now, you know, this is my experience too in mindfulness practices. Happens all the time. I'm keeping silence. I'm doing the practice. I'm watching my thoughts. Something happened like a week ago, and I wish I'd handled it differently. And so I go through a whole fantasy of how I would just totally figure this out, and what I would say, and I'd say something brilliant, and it would just slice through the problem and fix it on the spot. Basically, I'd be Superman, right? You know, in so many words, turning stones into bread. And you go through this. Has anybody had this experience? Kelby's nodding. Nancy, they're all nodding. Yeah. You go through, you reenact these things. This is mirrors Jesus' temptation, mirrors what we experience in mindfulness practice. It makes sense of the story, at least for me, and I think for others. So Jesus spends 40 days out there paying attention to these experiences and sorting out who he is and who he's not. And by the end of the time, he's taken the position of the observer, the loving, caring, divine observer. His identity has shifted toward God. And of course, you know, the story reflects meditation practice. You know, his attention drifted. Everybody's does. His too. Drifted away from being aware, but then he would come back to it. He would have this experience of being aware that he had lost his awareness and come back. It's a discipline, it takes time, and the temptation, if you will, is always there. St. Paul describes this situation well, this experience of going to the other side, if you will, away from your ego and personality, small s self, to the capital S divine self, in this process of contemplation, prayer, meditation. And there's this wonderful passage where he says, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me." The Christ is the human experience of God within us. The Christ is knowing your true self as God. And again, being aware that that doesn't mean you're the master of the universe, not at all, but that the core of your being, your truest self, is divine. Psalm 46, there's that wonderful passage where it says, be still, is the voice of God through the psalm. Be still and know that I am God. Let's try that out. Let's do it. Take a deep breath. Get comfy again. This will be another meditation. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be still. Be. This phrase that's in this meditation from the Psalms, the phrase I am, is connected to the wonderful story of Moses and the burning bush. Yes? Moses asks the bush, who is speaking as the divine, who are you? Who shall I say has sent me on this mission? And the bush answers back, I am that I am. Jesus in the Gospel of John, which is the most mystical of the Gospels, he keeps asking this question, who do you say that I am? He asks his disciples that over and over again. And over again he uses this phrase, I am. I am the door. I am the vine. I am the way. Yes? And of course when he says he's the door, that does not mean that he has hinges. When he says he's the way, that does not mean that he has striping down the center of the lane. He's making reference to the divine self, I am, that is in all of us, in him and in all of us. Once he said, before Abraham was, I am. And, of course, the Pharisees wanted to stone him for blasphemy on the spot because he was claiming to be God. But they misunderstood it in a very deep way. He's talking about the I am that is at the center of all of our being. The Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh had a great interpretation of this concept in his book, Living Buddha, Living Christ, the very famous Vietnamese Buddhist teacher of mindfulness practice. It's a beautiful book. And he says, we must distinguish between the I spoken by Jesus and the I that people usually think of. The I, in his statement, is life itself, his life, which is the way. If you do not really look at his life, you cannot see the way. If you only satisfy yourself with praising a name, even the name of Jesus, it is not practicing the life of Jesus. So we must practice living deeply, loving, and acting with charity if we really want to honor Jesus. So, the God who manifests within us as the loving observer, that is the I am in this phrase that Jesus uses in Scripture. That's an experience we all can share. Jesus, of course, was accused of blasphemy, in effect, by saying this. And guess what? So were all the mystics, many of the mystics of the Christian church through its history, had to deal with accusations of heresy. Meister Eckhart, now of course he had the very good sense to die of natural causes before he was put on trial for heresy. Okay, so he got under the wire. This happened repeatedly, actually, in Christian history. Mystics who were, pushing the edge there theologically would die first before it were burned at the stake. So, yes, there you go. Yeah. So it's part of the history of the church, this misunderstanding, this deep misunderstanding of what mystical experience is all about. It's not about claiming to be the master of the universe. It's about being aware of the divinity at the center of their being. One of the great classics of Christian spirituality is a book called The Cloud of Unknowing. Has anybody read this or seen this? Yeah, beautiful book. Another 14th century classic. And this is a book written by an anonymous Christian, probably a monk in England. And he clearly was into humility in a big way, on purpose left his name off of this work. But we presume it was a monk or a monastic person. And he says, to kind of explain this idea of finding God within yourself, he says, God is your being, but you are not his. He is your being, but you are not his. This is an elegant way of expressing this idea. We experience God as the ultimate reality of our being, but there's infinitely more to who God is than that. And this leads to a very profound humility that comes out of mystical spiritual experience. This awareness that comes with knowing God as the center of ourselves, but also being very deeply and powerfully, acutely aware that there's so much more beyond our own experience. In the Sermon on the Mount, we see Jesus teaching mindfulness too. One of his lines was, "The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light, but if your eye is unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness." That if the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? Okay. This takes a bit of context to understand. It turns out that in that ancient time, everybody, including Jesus, believed that eyes were in fact lamps. That is to say, the way that you see is the light comes out of your eye and intersects with the light that's in the rest of the world, and then comes back, and that's how you experience sight. So that little gleam I see in your eye there, that's light coming out of your eye. Everybody believed this until Leonardo da Vinci dissected the eye and discovered that it was a camera obscura, right? That it was dark in there. But light went into the eye. And things happened after that he couldn't explain. But the eye was dark. It was not a lamp. But Jesus and everybody else believed that it was. So it helps to understand this. So that there's a belief in ancient times, all the way up through the medieval era, that everybody had light in them. And this light came from the highest heaven. It was divine. And it was through this light that we could not only see the outside world, but observe the inside world too, the inner world as well. So that's how you have insight, yes? Is this light shining inside of yourself. So mindfulness is a practice of insight, yeah? It is turning on the lamp. You know, it's the lamp within you shining on your experience and seeing it from within. And just such sage words here, he's saying, now if you don't have that light, you're blind to the world and you're also blind to yourself. You don't get what's going on inside, you're not paying attention to that. There's a certain kind of blindness in that. Meister Eckhart used the image of light and fire many times in his sermons. And one image he uses very beautiful. He says, the soul is like a spark in a fire. Just imagine a campfire outdoors in the dark night. And a spark snaps out of the fire and goes up. And then it disappears, burns out, you know. It goes up and then it blanks out. And he says, what's happening there is that in order for the spark, which came originally from the divine light of the outermost heaven, in order for that spark to get back to its source, back to its Father in heaven. It has to annihilate itself. It has to let go of its attachment to its identity in order to return to its source. This is a beautiful image for mindfulness practice in Meister Eckhart. And we experience this in its practice, that you get to a point where you let go of your attachment to all that you're observing. You observe it, but you let go of your small s self, and you've identified with the capital S self as the source of the light that enables you to see all this within, and this also connects you to the outermost heaven. Also helps to understand the cosmology of the first century in order to make sense of the spirituality. Jesus and everybody else at the time believed in what we now call the Ptolemaic universe. So that's where you have 7 heavens. You've heard of the 7th heaven? This is where the idea came from, Ptolemaic universe. The bottom shell is the earth, and then there's the spheres. These are crystal spheres that move like this against each other, and each of them has a planet or the moon in them, right? And then they move, and the rubbing of the spheres is the music of the spheres. As they push together, as they touch, you get the subtle music. It's the divine source of all music on earth is from this movement of the spheres. And then the topmost sphere is the outermost realm of heaven, pure light. Right? St. Paul said that he was taken up to the 3rd heaven. What he meant by that is there's the earth is the first, the 6 heavens up here, above them, the spheres, and then the 3rd heaven is the realm of light, pure light. So the early Christians believed that what was happening in the Christ event was a complete change of the structure of the cosmos. So that because the Ptolemaic universe assumption was each descending sphere was less pure, less spiritually good, less spiritually in tune with the outermost realm. And so as each level, as you go up, that's a higher level of spirituality and also a higher level of authority. So that the spheres were, the Roman Empire was kind of structured in the same hierarchical way. So the early Christians believed that Jesus came to break through this cosmic system and bring the realm of light down to the earth and have direct rule of the realm of light, the divine world, on the earth. Up close and personal. So Christian spirituality from day one, with this cosmology of the early Christians, was about direct experience of the divine, directly encountering and knowing God personally. In Matthew chapter 6, in the Sermon on the Mount, there's this great passage about prayer. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, because they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and the street corners so they may be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. But whenever you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in heaven, who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. When you are praying, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. So, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is saying that prayer is an inner experience. It's something that happens inside. It's not, he's not banning public prayer, saying that you should never do that, but he's definitely saying that the heart of prayer is an inner experience. It is being in touch with God who knows all, right? Who knows everything that's going on in there. And by being in touch with God, we become aware of all that is inside. So it's a shared awareness with the divine, with God, of what is happening inside of us. Seeing our experiences, being able to stand back from them and observe them with this beautiful love of a Father who cares about you no matter what. Your prayer, and God's hearing of your prayer, then, are the same thing. if we interpret his words in the Sermon on the Mount in this way. Then, of course, we go on to the prayer of Jesus, right? The Lord's Prayer. And there's a passage in there in which he says, "Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And this, again, refers to the early Christian cosmology, that it's not going to be like it used to be here, where, bad things happen down here and only pure things happen up here. We're talking about a new order of things in which the pure realm of heaven, the will of the divine, is going to be enacted on the earth. So it's invoking that presence in life, in the real world, down here on the bottom sphere. So yeah, mysticism is the direct experience of the divine, bypassing the spheres of the heavens, right? Bypassing the hierarchy of the Roman Empire, bypassing the hierarchy of the church, by the way. And it's discovering the burning bush inside of our hearts that blazes on without consuming us. I think that's another very beautiful image, isn't it? The flame that burns without consuming. That's the burning bush. And that's what happens in mindfulness practice, is that the light is bright, and it's a brightness that does not consume us. And you get to that point of having that brightness that does not consume through the practice, through a discipline, right? I think very often, early on, particularly when people are just starting this practice, and it's reported throughout the history of Christian spirituality, many of the mystics say the same thing. You go through a period where you get burnt, right? So your lights are on now, your inner light is burning, you're seeing what's going on in there, and it scares the living whiz out of you, right? It's like, ooh boy, there's stuff going on there I don't like, or that scares me, right? So to get to a point where the light can be on, the flame can be burning without burning you up, that takes discipline, that takes time and practice. In the Cloud of Unknowing, this beautiful book from the 14th century, a lot of the references he makes in this book, and the imagery and the language, it winds up being present 200 years later in the work of St. John of the Cross, and also Teresa of Avila, the Spanish mystics. So it's the richness in this book is found, it's just part of a culture of Christian spirituality that lasted for a long time. But in the cloud, the idea that the imagery that he uses is that there's a cloud of unknowing and a cloud of forgetting. The cloud of unknowing is above you, so to speak, and the cloud of forgetting is below you. And as you go through your spiritual discipline, you have to forget. You have to let go of thoughts, experiences, images. It's the mindfulness practice. It's an image of as these experiences pass through your awareness and your consciousness, you drop them. You let them go, and they go down into the cloud of unknowing. And as you go through this, that lightens you up to get through the cloud of unknowing that connects you with the divine. There's a beautiful passage in the book. It goes like this: "Let your longing for God relentlessly beat upon the cloud of unknowing that is between you and your God. Pierce that cloud with the keen shaft of your love." Kind of sexy imagery there, wouldn't you say? Plenty of that in mystics. But the idea is that your love, this loving observance that you're making in your process of meditation, meditative prayer, lets go of all that gets in the way of God. In the Cloud of Unknowing, in Teresa of Avila, in St. John of the Cross, and many of the mystics, they use what's called the apophatic method, or also known as the via negativa, the way of negation. So the idea is the way you get to God is by letting go of everything that's in the way of God. Reaching God involves dropping anything that prevents you from experiencing God. And that's the via negativa. So the cloud advises this practice. And I think that's what happens for me in mindfulness practice is I'm letting go and letting go and letting go, and other stuff bubbles up and I let it go. And the process of letting go brings me into this consciousness, the God consciousness, the observer role that does not grasp, does not try to control the experience. And then the mystical moment, the mystical experience is possible. Here's another passage from the cloud that I think is very, very useful. If you want to gather all your desire into one simple word that the mind can retain, choose a short word rather than a long one. A one-syllable word such as God or love is best, but choose one that's meaningful for you. Straight out of TM, right? This is 14th century Christianity recommending mantras, right? An Eastern practice, well known in the West. Then fix this word in your mind so that it will remain there, come what may. This word will be your defense in conflict and in peace. Use it to beat upon the cloud of darkness above you and subdue all distractions, consigning them to the cloud of forgetting below you. Should some thought go on annoying you, demanding to know what you are doing, answer with this one word alone. If your mind begins to intellectualize over the meaning and connotations of this little word, remind yourself that its value lies in its simplicity. Do this, and I assure you that these thoughts will vanish. Why? Because you have refused to develop them with arguing. You've refused to develop them with arguing, which is a profound insight found in all practitioners of mindfulness practice. Yes? That you don't argue with the experience you're having. You don't develop it with fixes or solutions. You let it be and you let it go. Now, something to understand in Christian spirituality generally is that mindfulness is couched and lives in Christianity. It lives in the long tradition of confession. Yes? A deep principle of Christianity in general, and that we confess our sins, and in Catholicism you have confession, you have this practice, this very deep and important practice. And in the mystical tradition of the monastics of Christianity, confession wasn't just about saying, well, I stole some candy from the store down the street. No. The confessor would receive the confession from a fellow monk or nun, and the confession consisted of the challenges and difficulties that they were having in their prayer practice. Yes? So we have to understand the culture of monastic Christianity in order to understand this. So for instance, Teresa of Avila was, her confessor was St. John of the Cross. And there's a great story about, one of the nuns passed by in the monastery and saw both of them, him in the confession, over on this side and her on the other, with the screen in between, and both of them were levitating. It's probably apocryphal, but what it illustrates is the culture of confession in monastic Christianity. But this is about a mutual process of self-examination, of examination of one's inner experience and practice and thoughts. And the temptations, the distractions, if you will, that happen in the course of this type of practice. The cloud has this advice. It says, and there's another strategy you're welcome to try. When you feel utterly exhausted from fighting your thoughts, say to yourself, it is futile to contend with them any longer, and then fall down before them like a captive or a coward. For in doing this, you commend yourself to God in the midst of your enemies and admit the radical impotence of your nature. In employing it, In employing it, you make yourself completely supple in God's hands. It's like, give up, let go. And then you have the God moment, you have that experience. The cloud goes on with all sorts of other advice that would come straight out of the modern mindfulness textbook today. Here's a few passages. Simply sit, relaxed and quiet. The will needs only a brief fraction of a moment to move toward the object of its desire. I don't know about you, but in my mindfulness practice, I find that just wanting the experience, just a little bit of wanting in the midst of not having it, the wanting is the having. If that makes any sense. It's that movement of desire, just the tiniest movement of desire, gets you much closer. Be careful in this work and never strain your mind or imagination, for truly you will not succeed in this way. Leave these faculties at peace. Another line here. No sooner is a person turned toward God in love than through human frailty he finds himself distracted by the remembrance of some created thing or some daily care. But no matter, no harm done, for such a person quickly returns to deep recollection. Mindfulness advice. You're going to get distracted. It's inevitable. Observe the distraction. Observe the fact that you got distracted and you're back on the path. So, in Christianity, there's much more, of course, that we don't have time to cover. Today, there's the centering prayer movement. I mentioned a little bit about that earlier, which is a Catholic practice, very much like Zen Buddhism, actually. And it's part of this tradition. It's completely part of it. It came out of the Trappist order. So it lives on. And I have not mentioned so many other people in this tradition and mystics of the church that go on and on and on. You know, the Rhineland, the other Rhineland mystics. We've hardly scratched the surface here. The Quakers, many other practitioners of this tradition in Christianity. There's a Catholic priest, monk, a French monk who went to India. I don't know if Arvind, you've heard of this guy. Maybe I mentioned it to you before. Abhishektananda. This is a really interesting man who is a Christian monastic who went to India to practice Christian spirituality Hindu style, right? So he's living as a Hindu monk or Hindu guru, if you will, in India, and weaving together his Christian spiritual experience with Hinduism and Hindu practice. And so he wove these traditions together very seamlessly in his writing. A classic book that he wrote is called Prayer. And again, it's part of this very rich tradition of Christian mysticism and spirituality. And I think he said something in this book that I thought was very profound to close with today about the place of this practice. That mindfulness is not just something we do for ourselves. It's not just to make me a better person and to be more wise and better, me. It's not about me. It is in service of humanity, and it's in service of the evolution of consciousness on the planet. And he expresses that very beautifully here. All at once, everything became secular and profane, but at the very same moment, the sacredness of everything was rediscovered. No longer the symbolic sacredness attributed by men to things, but the essential sacredness, which is the universal radiance of the divine mystery, as it is manifested in the world and history. Only this experience of the depths of man and of God is able in these days to provide the world and the church with the intuitions which are needed in order to complete the dangerous transition already underway from the world of symbolic sacredness to that of the sacredness of the real. The solution to the present crisis will only be found in the deepening of contemplative life at the heart of the church. So it's my prayerful hope that indeed Christians will embrace the current cultural fascination with mindfulness practice and lift up the ways that the church has always practiced this and always embodied it in its tradition, and give this experience a deeper context and broader context in our spirituality for the sake of amplifying kindness and compassion in the whole world. Amen. And let's chat. Conversation. Yes, please, please.
You really got me thinking, Jim, about Catholic confession.
Yes.
And the idea that it's, I think, really meant to be a mindfulness practice. In other words, a mutual process with the confessor and confessee, but it's meant to be observing
Yes.
that something was stolen, observing I am he who stole the stuff, and but on the level of observation and letting that
Yes.
be,
Yes.
and and that there is letting be that there's judgment because the person's coming because they feel they shouldn't have done this, so there's an observation that there is a judgment, but it's letting it sit there.
Yes.
And then the response, which we call reconciliation of penitent, I mean, it's just, I never looked at it this way. The response is always mindfulness practices, because the response is always Hail Marys, Our Fathers, meditative, practice to let go of the whole damn thing. I mean, it's just fascinating to think about in those terms. So thank you for that.
Yeah, there's a culture, there are different, I mean, a lot of, again, like the confession culture, there's a problematic here, right? With confession and the concept of sin and guilt and all that. I mean, there's excess guilt in Christianity. Yes? Yeah, it's a problem. But in the spiritual tradition of the church, all the way back, this has had a context, which is, as you say, that the confession and the forgiveness and the absolution are all one thing. You pray in secret. It's not like there's different parts of the prayer. It's one thing. God already knows. Your challenge in prayer is to know with God, to join God in knowing what's going on in there. Yeah? And in the moment you know it, you're forgiven for the bad stuff in there at the same instant. It's instantaneous. It's all one thing. And that's right there in the words of Jesus, I think. So, others? Conversation. A few minutes with us. Yes. Your name, I'm sorry again.
Matt.
Matt, great.
What are some things you've experienced during meditation? Like, have you ever reached a point of ecstasy, or what are some quirks, I guess?
I have had ecstasies in meditation, and it's pretty interesting that all of the great tradition of the church and also of the East has always been, watch out for ecstasies. Don't get hung up on ecstasy. Ecstasy is great. Next. So yeah, I've had very, very high states in meditation practice of great, deep insight, peace, and joy beyond imagining. Next. That's the teaching universally in mystical practice. It's really interesting. That doesn't mean that doesn't downplay it. It's great to get there. Yes, wonderful, go. But the goal is knowing this relation, this relationship, this mystical union with God. And sometimes that can take very prosaic forms. It doesn't have to be chills and thrills, shining light. Others?
I'm recently homeless, about 7 or 8 months or so.
Wow. Yeah.
And one of the things I have found is a great deal of freedom here. Partly because there are no rules, or they're changing the rules, or the rule structure has been broken.
Yes.
You move from shelter to shelter, the rules change. As you move from group to group, the rules change. I just had some very profound insights. A little thing I picked up the other day is that the landmark we talked about service. And I always had a little problem with that. It somehow seemed that there had to be some work and there would be some stuff left over, some messed up stuff, some broken stuff laying around.
Yeah.
Kind of like to get a dollar, I had to pay for it. And I often couldn't see the dollar, so I wouldn't pay for it, so I held back and didn't out.
So you're having openings because of this.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's fodder for further conversation. Thank you.
I don't recommend it.
No. Others? Any other comments, reflections?
One of the reasons for coming tonight is the connection between mindfulness and Christianity.
Yes.
And I'm interested in where you see it going. Is this a temporary phase? Because I was talking to someone today about, the Chinese guy from Google.
Yes.
Was here
Jade
not so long
Mantan,
ago. And he's got these workshops, and in this company they got the workshop done there, and it seems like there's a certain amount of interest in
Yes.
it, and that's in a secular context, just as Google is a secular
Yes.
organization. So is it really going to catch on, or is it a passing fact?
I think what's happened is that it appears to be catching on. Now, it's interesting to look at the history of this. Again, it's all with 2,000 years of Christianity. There's that history. But in the Western world in the last 50 or 100 years even, you've seen this evolution from an interest in Eastern religions that was taken up by folks who were really interested in the esoteric and the unusual. So the Theosophists and the Vedanta Society and so on. So the fascination with the East early on. And then you get the beatnik Buddhists, right, of the 1950s. Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and many other poets and writers really got deep into Zen at that time. But it was a certain kind of Buddhism, spiritual practice. So you get beatnik Buddhism, and then you get the Beatles taking interest in the East, and then you get transcendental meditation, which took off and became a very popular thing, associated with a guru with a big beard and flowy clothes, right? Well, what's happened is that the flowy clothes and the big beard is gone, right? Now we have mindfulness practice, which has been identified as being a scientifically demonstrated useful practice for health, mental health and physical health. All sorts of evidence has come to the fore about this. And we've also seen the development of completely secular forms of this practice that are supported, they're very definable, describable, that then can be empirically tested. And so that's the new development, is the beards and the flowy robes are gone. And now you have meditation at Google Corporation, mindfulness practice. So that's progress in the sense that it translates for use for many more people who are put off by the long beard and the robes, right? So it opens it up culturally to a wider audience. At the same time, my hope, and that's why I'm doing this talk today, it's like, let's use this opening in the culture to go deeper with this material and to rediscover our spiritual religious traditions and how this fits into them so that we can experience yet more richness from this type of practice. And experience the other associated practices that go with it. So I'm very hopeful. Yeah, that's why we're doing this initiative, because we believe in it. We think it's great. So yeah, Colby.
So Thomas Merton has this famous question that you always open up his spiritual direction sessions with, of how are you doing surrendering to the divine within you, that which wants nothing more than all of you or your total self, something like that. Right? Which my spiritual director used on me last month and did a bunch of stuff. But there seems to be something in that kind of Christian statement
Yes.
that is about finding mindfulness and then moving. Right? Finding the mindfulness, naming that divine voice within, locating it, and then reacting to it, or engaging it, or responding to it, surrendering to it.
Yes.
Right? Which doesn't seem to be a part of the Eastern practice. And maybe I don't know enough about how the Eastern mindfulness works.
I certainly don't know enough to tell you.
But I know that if I'm mindful and release things, like, oh, I'm anxious, and I name it and it withers away, or something of that sort, right? I name the states and they go away. That's different from surrendering to and moving within the divine voice.
But a way of thinking about this is part of it is a language issue, how we describe these experiences. And for me, this experience of over the course of meditating, of practicing mindfulness, I get, as I say, to a point where I'm really, the me that matters is the divine point of view, if you will, the loving observer role. So you can think of that as surrendering to that. You've surrendered your small s self to this capital S divine self within that is lovingly observing without judgment and letting go of all that comes through. So it's just, it could be a way of describing it. I don't see that being incompatible at all myself. But I don't know enough about Eastern. It's a great question. Yeah, this idea of surrender. Think about that. Don't know. Others? Yes.
I come from the Catholic tradition.
Yes.
And but I practiced a lot of Buddhist meditation also. And the difference that I find is that Catholics are quite conceptual about in their approach, and the Buddhists are quite physical. And maybe there shouldn't be a big distinction between those two, but it certainly influences the type of meditation that's done.
Yes.
The Buddhists would focus on the breath or just the pure body presence.
Well, it depends on the Buddhism. It's something we didn't really get into here very much. Like, for instance, the centering prayer, which has now become a Catholic practice, very common, is a lot like Zen, in the sense that's Zen Buddhism, which is about letting go of thoughts and kind of erasing the mind's processes, if you will, by focusing on breath or on a mantra, etc. And that's an approach. That is one approach to meditation practice. Mindfulness practice comes from, in the Buddhist tradition, is found in Vipassana type of Buddhism, which is pretty different than Zen in the approach that it takes. And what I would suggest is, what I'm talking about here is about more the Vipassana approach as it applies, as it shows itself in Christianity. So there's a distinction there to be made. I think a lot of folks would say that both approaches may well aim at the same end, right? If you use the mantra, if you focus on the breath, etc., that will get you to a place where you let go of the small s self. You're having experiences that you allow to flow away, and you identify with the divine. I mean, this is the Eastern Orthodox tradition. This is a big deal too. This same kind of somewhat more Zen approach. You read like the Way of the Pilgrim, which illustrates the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy upon me, which becomes the mantra. And the monk, the lay monk, who's the focus of the book, the protagonist, just repeats this endlessly, right? This mantra, non-stop, where it just becomes the hum in his brain at all times. It clears out everything else, but what it does is, he doesn't stop thinking or acting. He's out in the world, but this practice opens up just this wellspring of kindness, compassion to everybody he meets, and this magic stuff happens, of miracles of love that happen along the road of this path. So a different technique with the same end.